Section 25 of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 25. He had reached his hotel. He crossed the hall with its mounds of reddish chairs and sofas, its spike-leaved, withered-looking plants. He got his key off the hook. The young lady handed him some letters. He went upstairs. He saw her most often at Burton in the late summer, when he stayed there for a week or fortnight even, as people did in those days. First on top of some hill, there she would stand, hands clapped to her hair, her cloak blowing out, pointing, crying to them. She saw the 7 beneath. Or in a wood, making the kettle boil, very ineffective with her fingers, the smoke curtsying, blowing in their faces, her little pink face showing through, begging water from an old woman in a cottage, who came to the door to watch them go. They walked always, the others drove. She was bored driving, disliked all animals except that dog. They tramped miles along roads. She would break off to get her bearings, pilot him back across country. And all the time they argued, discussed poetry, discussed people, discussed politics. She was a radical then. Never noticing a thing except when she stopped, cried out at a view or a tree, and made him look with her. And so on again, through stubble fields, she walking ahead with a flower for her aunt, never tired of walking for all her delicacy, to drop down on Burton in the dusk. Then after dinner old Breitkopf would open the piano and sing without any voice, and they would lie sunk in armchairs, trying not to laugh, but always breaking down and laughing at nothing. Breitkopf was supposed not to see, and then in the morning flirting up and down like a wagtail in front of the house. Oh, it was a letter from her! This blue envelope, that was her hand. And he would have to read it. Here was another of those meetings, bound to be painful. To read her letter needed the devil of an effort. How heavenly it was to see him. She must tell him that. That was all. But it upset him. It annoyed him. He wished she hadn't written it. Coming on top of his thoughts, it was like a nudge in the ribs. Why couldn't she let him be? After all, she had married Dalloway, and lived with him in perfect happiness all these years. These hotels are not consoling places. Far from it. Any number of people had hung up their hats on those pegs. Even the flies, if you thought of it, had settled on other people's noses. As for the cleanliness which hit him in the face, it wasn't cleanliness so much as bareness, frigidity, a thing that had to be. Some arid matron made her rounds at dawn, sniffing, peering, causing blue-nosed maids to scour, for all the world as if the next visitor were a joint of meat to be served on a perfectly clean platter. For sleep, 1 bed. For sitting in, 1 armchair. For cleaning one's teeth and shaving one's chin, 1 tumbler, 1 looking-glass. Books, letters, dressing-gowns slipped about on the impersonality of the horsehair like incongruous impertinences. And it was Clarissa's letter that made him see all this. Heavenly to see you. She must say so. He folded the paper, pushed it away. Nothing would induce him to read it again. To get that letter to him by 6 o'clock, she must have sat down and written it directly he left her. Stamped it, sent somebody to the post. It was, as people say, very like her. She was upset by his visit. She had felt a great deal, had, for a moment, when she kissed his hand, regretted, envied him even, remembered possibly, for he saw her look it, something he had said, how they would change the world if she married him, perhaps. Whereas it was this. It was middle age. It was mediocrity. Then forced herself with her indomitable vitality to put all that aside, there being in her a thread of life which for toughness, endurance, power to overcome obstacles and carry her triumphantly through, he had never known the like of. Yes, but there would come a reaction directly he left the room. She would be frightfully sorry for him. She would think what in the world she could do to give him pleasure, short always of the one thing. And he could see her with the tears running down her cheeks, going to her writing-table and dashing off that one line which he was to find greeting him. Heavenly to see you. And she meant it. Peter Walsh had now unlaced his boots. But it would not have been a success, their marriage. The other thing, after all, came so much more naturally. It was odd. It was true. Lots of people felt it. Peter Walsh, who had done just respectably, filled the usual posts adequately, was liked, but thought a little cranky, gave himself airs. It was odd that he should have had, especially now that his hair was grey, a contented look. a look of having reserves. It was this that made him attractive to women who liked the sense that he was not altogether manly. There was something unusual about him, or something behind him. It might be that he was bookish, never came to see you without taking up the book on the table. He was now reading, with his bootlaces trailing on the floor. Or that he was a gentleman, which showed itself in the way he knocked the ashes out of his pipe, and in his manners, of course, to women. For it was very charming and quite ridiculous how easily some girl without a grain of sense could twist him round her finger, but at her own risk. That is to say, though he might be ever so easy, and indeed with his gaiety and good breeding fascinating to be with, it was only up to a point. She said something. No, he saw through that. He wouldn't stand that. No. Then he could shout and rock and hold his sides together over some joke with men. He was the best judge of cooking in India. He was a man. But not the sort of man one had to respect, which was a mercy, not like Major Simmons, for instance. Not in the least like that, Daisy thought, when, in spite of her 2 small children, she used to compare them. He pulled off his boots. He emptied his pockets. Out came with his pocket-knife a snapshot of Daisy on the veranda, Daisy all in white, with a fox terrier on her knee. Very charming, very dark. The best he had ever seen of her. It did come, after all, so naturally. So much more naturally than Clarissa. No fuss, no bother, no finicking and fidgeting, all plain sailing. And the dark, adorably pretty girl on the veranda exclaimed. He could hear her. Of course she would give him everything, she cried. She had no sense of discretion. Everything he wanted, she cried, running to meet him, whoever might be looking. And she was only 24, and she had 2 children. Well, indeed, he had got himself into a mess at his age, and it came over him when he woke in the night pretty forcibly. Suppose they did marry. For him it would be all very well, but what about her? Mrs. Burgess, a good sort and no chatterbox, in whom he had confided, thought this absence of his in England, ostensibly to see lawyers, might serve to make Daisy reconsider, think what it meant. It was a question of her position, Mrs. Burgess said, the social barrier, giving up her children. She'd be a widow with a past one of these days, draggling about in the suburbs, or more likely, indiscriminate. You know, she said, what such women get like, with too much paint. But Peter Walsh pooh-poohed all that. He didn't mean to die yet. Anyhow, she must settle for herself, judge for herself, he thought, padding about the room in his socks, smoothing out his dress shirt, for he might go to Clarissa's party, or he might go to one of the halls, or he might settle in and read an absorbing book written by a man he used to know at Oxford. And if he did retire, that's what he'd do, write books. He would go to Oxford and poke about in the Bodleian. Vainly the dark, adorable, pretty girl ran to the end of the terrace, vainly waved her hand, vainly cried she didn't care a straw what people said. There he was, the man she thought the world of, the perfect gentleman, the fascinating, the distinguished, and his age made not the least difference to her. Padding about a room in an hotel in Bloomsbury, shaving, washing, continuing, as he took up cans, put down razors, to poke about in the Bodleian, and get at the truth about 1 or 2 little matters that interested him. And he would have a chat with whoever it might be, and so come to disregard more and more precise hours for lunch, and miss engagements, and when Daisy asked him, as she would, for a kiss, a scene, fail to come up to the scratch, though he was genuinely devoted to her. In short, it might be happier, as Mrs. Burgess said, that she should forget him, or merely remember him as he was in August 1922, like a figure standing at the crossroads at dusk, which grows more and more remote as the dog-cart spins away, carrying her securely fastened to the back seat, though her arms are outstretched, and as she sees the figure dwindle and disappear, still she cries out how she would do anything in the world, anything. He never knew what people thought. It became more and more difficult for him to concentrate. He became absorbed. He became busied with his own concerns, now surly, now gay, dependent on women, absent-minded, moody, less and less able, so he thought as he shaved, to understand why Clarissa couldn't simply find them a lodging and be nice to Daisy, introduce her. And then he could just do what? Just haunt and hover. He was at the moment actually engaged in sorting out various keys, papers. Swoop and taste. Be alone, in short, sufficient to himself. And yet nobody, of course, was more dependent upon others. He buttoned his waistcoat. It had been his undoing. He could not keep out of smoking rooms, liked colonels, liked golf, liked bridge, and above all women's society, and the fineness of their companionship, and their faithfulness and audacity and greatness in loving, which, though it had its drawbacks, seemed to him, and the dark, adorably pretty face was on top of the envelopes, so wholly admirable, so splendid a flower to grow on the crest of human life, and yet he could not come up to the scratch, being always apt to see round things. Clarissa had sapped something in him permanently, and to tire very easily of mute devotion, and to want variety in love, though it would make him furious if Daisy loved anybody else, furious, for he was jealous, uncontrollably jealous by temperament. He suffered tortures. But where was his knife, his watch, his seals, his note-case, and Clarissa's letter, which he would not read again but like to think of, and Daisy's photograph? And now for dinner. They were eating. Sitting at little tables round vases, dressed or not dressed, with their shawls and bags laid beside them, with their air of false composure, for they were not used to so many courses at dinner, and confidence, for they were able to pay for it, and strain, for they had been running about London all day shopping, sightseeing, and their natural curiosity, for they looked round and up as the nice-looking gentlemen in horn-rimmed spectacles came in, and their good nature, for they would have been glad to do any little service, such as lend a timetable or impart useful information, and their desire, pulsing in them, tugging at them subterraneously, somehow to establish connections, if it were only a birthplace, Liverpool, for example, in common, or friends of the same name, with their furtive glances, odd silences, and sudden withdrawals into family jocularity and isolation. There they sat eating dinner when Mr. Walsh came in and took his seat at a little table by the curtain. It was not that he had said anything, for being solitary he could only address himself to the waiter. It was his way of looking at the menu, of pointing his forefinger to a particular wine, of hitching himself up to the table, of addressing himself seriously, not gluttonously, to dinner, that won him their respect, which, having to remain unexpressed for the greater part of the meal, flared up at the table where the Morrises sat when Mr. Walsh was heard to say at the end of the meal, "Bartlett pears." Why he should have spoken so moderately yet firmly, with the air of a disciplinarian well within his rights, which are founded upon justice, neither young Charles Morris nor old Charles, neither Miss Elaine nor Mrs. Morris knew. But when he said Bartlett pears, sitting alone at his table, they felt that he counted on their support in some lawful demand, was champion of a cause which immediately became their own, so that their eyes met his eyes sympathetically, and when they all reached the smoking-room simultaneously, a little talk between them became inevitable. It was not very profound, only to the effect that London was crowded, had changed in 30 years, that Mr. Morris preferred Liverpool, that Mrs. Morris had been to the Westminster Flower Show, and that they had all seen the Prince of Wales. Yet, thought Peter Walsh, no family in the world could compare with the Morrises, none whatever, and their relations to each other are perfect, and they don't care a hang for the upper classes, and they like what they like, and Elaine is training for the family business, and the boy has won a scholarship at Leeds, and the old lady, who is about his own age, had 3 more children at home, and they have 2 motor cars, but Mr. Morris still mends the boots on Sunday. It is superb. It is absolutely superb, thought Peter Walsh, swaying a little backwards and forwards with his liqueur glass in his hand among the hairy red chairs and ashtrays, feeling very well pleased with himself, for the Morrises liked him. Yes, they liked a man who said Bartlett pears. They liked him, he felt. He would go to Clarissa's party. The Morrises moved off, but they would meet again. He would go to Clarissa's party because he wanted to ask Richard what they were doing in India, the conservative duffers, and what's being acted, and music. Oh yes, and mere gossip. For this is the truth about our soul, he thought, ourself, who fish-like inhabits deep seas and plies among obscurities, threading her way between the bowls of giant weeds, over sun-flickered spaces, and on into gloom, cold, deep, inscrutable. Suddenly she shoots to the surface and sports on the wind-wrinkled waves, that is, has a positive need to brush, scrape, kindle herself, gossiping. What did the government mean, Richard Dalloway would know, to do about India? End of section 25, read by Hannah Dormer, London, 24th of October 2021.